Welcome to Echo 371, Study Session 8, Fiscal Policy, Introduction. In this study session, we will examine the measure taken by government to influence the behavior of the economy. Monetary policy and fiscal policy are the two most important macroeconomic policies adopted by the government in influencing the behavior of the economy. Our focus will be on fiscal policy, which is the way government attempts to manage the economy through taxation, spending, and borrowing. Learning outcomes. After you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Explain the stances of fiscal policy. 2. Highlight how fiscal policy can be used to achieve stability. 3. Point out the positive effects and negative effects of fiscal policy. 4. Present the limitation of fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the one that deals with the aggregate effect of government expenditure and taxation on income, production, employment, and other economic activities. Fiscal policy can also be referred to as the overall effect of the budget outcome on economic activities. Governments use fiscal policy in an attempt to maintain economic growth, high employment, and low inflation. A good and effective fiscal policy must be able to keep all necessary ingredients like expenditure, loans, transfers, tax revenue, and income from property, debt management in a proper balance in order to achieve the best possible result in terms of desired economic objectives. Fiscal policy can be expansionary, contractionary, or neutral. A. Expansionary or loose fiscal policy. During periods of unemployment, expansionary fiscal policy is usually adopted. Fiscal policy is expansionary when 1. Taxation is reduced or public spending is increased with the aim of stimulating total spending in the economy, known as aggregate demand. 2. Government feels its economy is not growing fast enough or unemployment is too high. By increasing the spending or cutting taxes, government leaves individuals and businesses with more money to purchase goods or invest in new equipment. When individuals or firms increase their purchases, they raise demand, which requires additional production, creating jobs and generating more spending. The result is higher employment and a growing economy. Expansionary fiscal policy is usually associated with budget deficit. B. Contractionary or tight fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is contractionary or tight when taxation is increased or public spending is reduced in order to restrict demand and slow down the economy. Government often resorts to contractionary fiscal policy like reduction in government expenditure, that is, sales of existing bonds, decrease in money supply to attain budget surplus. Governments also increase tax rates so as to reduce disposable income of consumers, which will reduce aggregate demand. C. Neutral fiscal policy. This implies a balanced budget where government expenditure is equal to tax revenue. Government expenditure is fully funded by tax revenue, and the overall budget outcome has a neutral effect on the level of economic activities. Using fiscal policy to achieve stability. Economic stability means a steady non-inflationary economic expansion in output, and employment coupled with a very mild rises in price. Instability occurs in an economy when there is a recurring cyclical phase of upward and downward cumulative movement in income, employment, output, and prices. Fiscal policy can be effectively used by the government to neutralize the destabilizing forces. For instance, during the period of depression, which is caused by a deficit of effective demand, fiscal policy can remedy it by increasing government expenditure and by encouraging private expenditure. Also, during a boom period, there is a need to control the demand by reducing government expenditure and private expenditure. The economy would be able to recover from depression if government expenditure is primarily directed towards consumption and welfare type expenditure without creating additional productive capacity. The productive activity of such economy picks up fast and existing unutilized capacity is put to use. Taxation is an effective tool in encouraging expenditure in the private sector. A reduction in tax rates increases profit and reduces the cost of production and prices. Lower prices are expected to increase demand, production, and employment, which in turn add to the effective demand. Also, an increase in import duties diverts domestic demand for imported goods from imports to produced goods. A reduction or abolition of export duties or export subsidies increases the demand for export and contributes towards recovery from depression. Why would government fail in countering inflationary pressure and reducing effective demand? The most common reason for government failure in countering inflationary pressure and reducing effective demand is their inability to reduce their own expenditure. For instance, 1. Governments fail to reduce unnecessary and wasteful public consumption expenditure for several non-economic reasons, e.g., surplus government employees are not retrenched on political and humanitarian grounds. 2. As a result of increases in prices of goods and services, there is a pressure on government to increase salaries and pensions. 3. There are some areas of public expenditure where government is committed to certain level of expenditure, such as interest payment, repayment of outstanding debt obligations, and other contractual payments. Effects of fiscal policy. 1. It stimulates the level of aggregate demand. Fiscal policy is used by the government to stimulate the level of aggregate demand in the economy. These can be used in times of depression or low economic activity as an essential tool in providing the framework for strong economic growth and working towards full employment. For instance, a fiscal expansion raises aggregate demand in two ways. First, if government increases its purchases but keeps taxes constant, it increases demand directly. Secondly, if the government cuts taxes or increases transfer payment, households' disposable income rises and they will spend more on consumption. This rise in consumption will in turn raise aggregate demand. 2. It increases the prices of goods and services and the level of output. A fiscal expansion increases the demand for goods and services, which in turn leads to increases in output and prices. The extent to which higher demand increases output depends on the state of the business cycle. during a depression with unused productive capacity and unemployed workers, increase in demand will lead to more output without changing the price level. On the other hand, if the economy is at full employment, a fiscal expansion will lead to increase in price level and have less impact on the total output. 3. Fiscal policy is an essential tool for economic stabilization. Government uses fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. During the period of depression, when there is decline in economic activity, the government can run an expansionary fiscal policy. That is, government reduces taxes or increases public expenditure. 4. On the other hand, during a boom, government can run budget surplus, helping to slow down the economy when inflation is perceived to be greater a problem than unemployment. 5. A fiscal expansion reduces government savings. A fiscal policy in which government reduces taxation and increases expenditure leads to lower savings rate, which in turn means that the government will either invest less in new plants and machinery or increase the amount that it borrows from abroad, both of which leads to unpleasant consequences in the long run. A. Lower investment leads to lower capital stock and to a reduction in a country's ability to produce output in the future. B. Increase indebtedness to foreigners means a larger proportion of the country's future income will have to be sent abroad to repay loans and interest. Fiscal policy can lead to an increase in interest rate. If government adopts expansionary fiscal policy in which it runs budget deficit, there will be need to fund the budget deficit either from public borrowing, that is the issue of government bonds, overseas borrowing, or printing of new money. When governments fund a deficit budget with release of government bonds, there will be an increase in interest rate across the market because government borrowing creates higher demand for credit in the financial market. An expansionary fiscal policy can lead to inflation. An unchecked spiral increase in aggregate demand as a result of expansionary fiscal policy put in place can lead to inflationary pressure. Hence, there is need to check the rate of increase in aggregate demand. Limitation to fiscal policy. 1. Time lag. The use of fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, either during the period of a depression or a boom, takes some time lag for the policy to be effected in the economy. There are two types of time lags. A. Inside lag. This is the period between the need for a policy, that is time of occurrence of the shock, and the ability of government to recognize the appropriate policy response to counter the effect. B. Outside lag. This is a period between the implementation of a policy and detectable effect in the economy. In developing countries like Nigeria, it takes a long time for approval and implementation of a policy because such policy must be debated by the House of Representatives and Senate. Hence, such time lag limits the effectiveness of fiscal policy. 2. Tax evasion and avoidance. When individuals or corporate bodies avoid paying taxes or reduce the amount to be paid as tax, it limits the effectiveness of fiscal policy. The issue of tax evasion has been a problem in Nigeria for a very long time. 3. Weak economic structure. All other sectors of the economy need to work together for the effectiveness of fiscal policy. In Nigeria, there is a weak interdependence among the different sectors of the economy. More so, government is unable to maintain budget discipline. All this limits the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Number 4, political instability. Frequent change of government administration may limit the effectiveness of fiscal policy because different governments are associated with different economic priorities. Summary. In this study session, you learned how government can use fiscal policy in spending and taxation to influence the economy. Fiscal policy is said to be neutral when tax revenue is equal to the spending. This implies a balanced budget which has a neutral effect on the economy. Fiscal policy could also be tight or contractionary when revenue is higher than spending, and loose or expansionary when spending is higher than revenue. Fiscal policy can be used in so many ways to affect the overall workings of the economy. For instance, fiscal policy can be used to stabilize the economy both during the period of a depression and a boom. It can be used to stimulate the level of aggregate demand. This is the end of study session 8. Thanks for listening.